It is now my distinct honor to present this year's George P. Shultz Award for Distinguished Service to General Raymond T. Odierno. This award is named for our very good friend, George Shultz, a man who exemplifies the best in American leadership and statesmanship. During his tenure in government, Secretary Shultz confronted enormous challenges in what we now know to have been the final battles of the Cold War. The end of that conflict was never guaranteed. After holding 3 cabinet-level positions in the Nixon administration, Mr. Shultz was appointed Secretary of State by President Reagan in 1982. He served in that capacity for almost 7 years, a term nearly unprecedented in the modern era. He is one of the most respected statesmen of the 20th century. He is still active to this day. As Secretary of State, he would routinely bring to his office new U.S. ambassadors. And in that office, he kept a large globe. And he would spin the globe. He would say, "Show me the country you'll be representing." And often the diplomat would look closely at the globe and abruptly halt its motion, and he would indicate Botswana or Bhutan or Brunei or whatever country he'd be calling home for the next years, and he'd point to it very proudly, and Secretary Shultz would shake his head and say, no. You'll be representing the United States of America. You should never forget that. George Shultz has dedicated his life to defending freedom and democratic values. He has provided FDD with invaluable advice over the years and guidance. We are deeply grateful for the relationship we have been able to sustain with Secretary Shultz. And so in 2012, we established the George P. Shultz Award for Distinguished Service to recognize those who follow his example and perpetuate his legacy. Today, it is our honor to present the 4th annual George P. Shultz Award for Distinguished Service to you, General Odierno, in recognition of your dedicated service, your leadership and commitment to defending U.S. national security, freedom, and democracy. General Odierno served as the 38th Chief of Staff of the United States Army from September 7th, 2011 to August 14th, 2015, when he retired from active military service. During more than 39 years of service, he commanded units at every echelon, from platoon to theater, with duty in Germany, Albania, Kuwait, Iraq, and the United States. General Odierno has a distinguished record of service, and I won't list all his accomplishments today, but I want to talk a little bit about his determination. General Odierno spent more time in Iraq than any other U.S. Army general, more than 4 years, the last 2 as the top commander. And in 2006, when he looked at the situation on the ground, at the escalating violence and instability, at the fairly desperate situation, as he candidly called it, he began to push for a new approach. Not without difficulty did he and a few others manage to convince both the military and policymakers in Washington that a new strategy was necessary, was the right answer, a new approach. General Odierno persisted, understanding the importance of the mission, not only for Iraqi security, not only for regional stability, but for America's security and credibility. Along with General David Petraeus, he built and implemented the surge together and against the odds and the predictions of many pundits and politicians, many journalists. They took a war that was on the verge of defeat and they turned it around. Not only by adding more troops, but by completely revamping the way we were fighting the war and interacting with the Iraqi population. The U.S. military waged a counterinsurgency that decimated al-Qaeda and the Iranian-backed militias as well. This was an enormous achievement, which is what makes it so disappointing that just a few years later, that progress has failed to be sustained, something I hope we'll hear more about. American troops are now back in Iraq, fighting the Islamic State, a splinter from al-Qaeda, which rose from the ashes to become a formidable enemy, erasing borders and declaring what it calls a caliphate. And the Islamic Republic of Iran, responsible for so many American deaths in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Lebanon, in other places, has strengthened not just as the dominant player in Baghdad, but as a rising hegemon across the region. General Odierno has battled both Sunni and Shia jihadi revolutionaries, and so we look forward to his advice to the next administration, to the next president, on whether the American approach should change and can change, and if so, what would constitute a coherent doctrine and a coherent strategy. In the wake of the Iran nuclear deal, General Odierno emphasized that the United States must work hard to repair its relationships with Saudi Arabia, with Egypt, and other Sunni allies in the region. We've got to lead, he said. We at FDD share General Odierno's belief in the importance of American leadership. There is simply no good alternative. In recognition of that record that General Odierno has, FDD is honored to present the George P. Shultz Award for Distinguished Service to you, General Odierno.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. It's our pleasure. One more time.
I'm going to turn this over to Catherine Herridge, who will conduct, I'm sure, a very illuminating and edifying conversation.
If I could, just before we start, I had a chance to talk with Secretary Shultz about a year ago out at Stanford, and it's always wonderful to have a chance to go out there and talk with him because, you know, he spends a lot of time training our young men and women out, not only at Stanford, but a lot of our military fellows that are out there, and his service continues. And whenever you have a conversation with Secretary Shultz, you have to be on your toes because he is prepared to talk about any and every subject. So thank you it's a great honor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Catherine.
Thank you, Cliff. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I'm very grateful and honored to be moderating the panel. General Odierno, I'm inspired by your service as someone in a military family, and also want to recognize the service of your wife and your kids, because without their support, your work would not have been possible. Let's begin with the issue of readiness. Is the U.S. Army in a position to effectively fight a major war?
Well, I would say what people have to realize that over the whole time, I tell you, I failed miserably as the Chief of Staff of the Army because as the 4 years as the Chief, our budget was reduced by 25%. And that's the same with all the services, just not the Army. So we lost capability. Now, some of it we needed to cut. I think there were some efficiencies that we needed to gain, but I think they went too deep. So I think I'm concerned. And what I tell everyone is actually in today's world, it's a bigger problem because actually I go back to the Cold War. It was easier because we knew who our enemy was, we knew where they were at, we knew what their capabilities were, we knew what we needed in order to fight them. Today, frankly, the way the world is, we have to be prepared to respond potentially on 5 different continents simultaneously. And that capability that we need in order to do that, I'm not sure we have right now, and I'm worried about it. And so I really hope that as we get into once we have the nominees from both parties, we get into a real debate about what we have to do about national security and talk about what are the capabilities that we need across our military to include the Army, because I think it's an important one. Because as I've stated publicly before, the velocity of instability around the world is increasing. And it might not be the most dangerous time, but it certainly is the most complex and complicated time that we face. So we have to have a military that's prepared to respond, along with, obviously, our ability to conduct political and economic development around the country.
So what's the one change that you think could get us to that point of readiness?
I think we have to add a bit more money back into the budget. And I'm not looking at maybe growing necessarily the services, but we need the money in order to sustain our training, our equipment, because the American people expect us to have the best military in the world, which we do. But I worry that if we don't reinvest in them, that there'll come a day when we're sending people into harm's way that aren't trained the way we expect them to be trained, and then that ultimately costs us in lives, and we don't want to see that happen.
I'd like to turn to Iraq. In your estimation, are we winning in Iraq?
Well, I mean, I think, first, if I could just, it's become so much more complex than it once was. It's no longer just about Iraq. It's about Iraq, it's about Syria, it's about ISIS and how they're growing. It's about Iran versus, and Saudi Arabia, Shia, Sunni, Arab, Persians. So it's much more complex than it was. So I believe there's significant issues, and I think it's going to take a lot of effort to solve all of those problems. I have said publicly that I believe if we really wanted to, we can go in and defeat ISIS militarily. That's not the issue. Of course, it would cost lives, cost a lot of money. We can do that. But the problem is what happens the day after? I've been through this once before, and I don't want to see us go through it again. In 2010 and 11, we had Iraq to a point where it was peaceful. It was growing economically. Politically, it looked like it might be going in the right direction. But what happened is we never had a sustainable plan that would enable the political system to continue to work after we left. So until we solve that problem, we can defeat them militarily, but we'll go right back to this 2 or 3 years after that again. So it's got to be we've got to come up with a solution that's military in nature combined with political solutions. It has to be done by a coalition of partners, European, Arab, U.S., that comes up with the right solution in order to manage and govern these areas. Because what we've learned over the last 5 or 10 years is that where we have problems when you have ungoverned territories or you have failing governments or failed governments. And that's what we've watched play out. You had a failing government in Syria, you have a failing government in Iraq. And so what you see is people, when they get frustrated, they turn to violence. And then you have groups like ISIS that are exploiting the problems that are occurring within that group. If I could just take a minute on ISIS. What I worry about ISIS is they are growing fast. They are expanding outside of Iraq, Syria, we all know, expanding into North Africa. They're trying to expand in other parts of the world. And it's the perception of this movement that is having an impact and effect. So it's important for us that we don't allow them to hold territory, because as long as they're able to hold territory, it gives them credible credence in order to continue to recruit. So I believe in the next couple of years, we have to eliminate them in terms of holding territory. You're never going to eliminate the movement. It will always be there. But you certainly can limit it to an effect that will no longer be growing around the world. And now we're seeing, obviously, attacks in Europe. You know, we've had some rogue attacks here in the United States. And we have to go after that movement.
So on that point of taking back the real estate, how many boots on the ground would you need to have, and what would that look like?
Well, I think so. You know, it's all connected to each other. So first off, in order, in my opinion, to have a credible solution, you've got to have. You can't take one off the table. So you got to have a credible military capability. You got to have a credible political capability, and then we have to figure out how economically do we develop it. So you've got to have all three of those. So from a military standpoint, I would tell you, first I would say we need to have a coalition of capabilities. It should not be U.S. only, but it probably has to be U.S.-led. I believe only the United States can bring the countries together that can do this. And I believe it should be countries, again, it should be countries within the Middle East. It needs to be countries in Europe, and needs to be led by the United States that would put enough capability on the ground that would allow us to defeat ISIS. I tell everyone,
just to jump in,
sure.
What kind of number would you assign to that? I mean,
well, I haven't studied it intently to give you a number, but I'm going to tell you it's a big number. I mean,
20,000?
Bigger than that.
30?
Yeah, probably around 50.
Okay, 50,000.
But that's with a coalition of capability. Okay. That's with a coalition of capability. And what troops on the ground do is actually helps you with intelligence. See, we have great technical means to collect intelligence, but there's nothing like having people on the ground that can develop intelligence that is accurate, precise, that allows us to really go after those who are the head of these organizations and can really take ISIS out.
And just on that point, so when we withdrew from Iraq, did we effectively blind ourselves in terms of the intelligence?
Yeah, I mean, I think, so what we did is, we lost our, what we call human intelligence network on the ground. I mean, we used to have a pretty significant human intelligence network that we had, and so as we pulled out our U.S. military, we lose that. So we have to depend on Iraqis, which they collect intelligence, but they do it a bit differently than we do, and they look for different things than we might look for.
And then you were getting to your third point, the military, you said the political, and then the economic.
Yeah, and so I would just say, and then what you have to do is you have to have a plan to govern after this is done, and then you have to have a plan of economic development, because ultimately, if you don't have that, again, we'll fall right back into where we are today.
So thinking about this sort of day after plan, is it a realistic goal to see a unified Iraq as the end result?
So I've talked about this before, and I'll make it clear. I would like to have a unified Iraq. That would be what I would like to have. And in 2010, I was very clear that's what I want to. I'm thinking, today I think it's becoming harder and harder to have a unified Iraq. And the reason is I believe the influence of Iran inside of Iraq is so great, they will never allow the Sunnis to participate in a meaningful way in the government. If that doesn't happen, you cannot have a unified Iraq. So if we can come up with some plan that says we're going to allow Sunnis to participate, fine. But since we left, it hasn't happened. You know, as soon as we left, Sunni leaders were arrested. They were taken, the military leaders were taken out of command. So it's clear to me the intentions were to limit Sunni influence within the government and the military. In order to have a unified Iraq, you have to have people participating equally, and it can't be the ones you handpick to participate. It's got to be those who are representing the different groups and the people of Iraq.
But doesn't it seem less and less likely because Iran's hand has really been strengthened by the JCPOA? So wouldn't it really be in our national interest to recognize that it has now effectively divided into three? I think we should take a look at it and figure out, can we do it or not, and would that be a better solution? I just think we should at least take a hard look at it, because I don't see another solution besides that. What could we do to further support the Kurds?
Well, I mean, I think, first off, I think first they fought heroically during the last year or so. And I think we just have to continue to make sure they are trained and equipped to continue to do that. I think they want to, we have to make sure that they continue to get the economics that help them to sustain it over a long period of time, because, again, once it's over, they got to be able to sustain themselves, and that gets back into oil. This gets back into their deal with the central government. Do they get 17% of all the oil revenues, or do they just try to work on their own to gain revenue from the oil? So I think for us, the main thing for the Kurds is to keep training them, helping them be equipped to fight, and then helping them to come up with economic and political solutions in order for it to be sustained over a long period of time. But you're not going to win this fight just with Kurds. I mean, the Kurds can only do so much. I mean, they have their own interests that they have. And so we have to make them capable, but you've got to have other Iraqis, Sunni and Shia, fighting against this threat. And if you don't have that, it's going to be difficult. When you're on a battlefield, what you want to do is you want to create multiple dilemmas for your adversary. And so you want to pressure them from 2 or 3 different ways. You want to pressure them. So, what I would do, is you got to go after, what you're trying to do, you got to go after them from all 3 sides, north, south, east, west, 4 sides. You got to go after their money. And in my opinion, we should have an international coalition that's working together to go after their money and punish those who are funding ISIS inside of Iraq and Syria. I think, and then I think we have to come up with a group of people trying to figure out what we do from a governance perspective afterwards. And that's how you're going to defeat this threat. Intense pressure militarily, intense pressure economically to take away their funding, and then a solution is to come up with a way how we're going to govern after we're finished. There have been significant damage inflicted as a result of the airstrikes. But is it true that when you sustain limited strikes over a long period of time, you create a smarter enemy? They burrow further into the cities? Well, I think what airstrikes have done is, first, it's limited their ability to acquire more land. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's allowed the Iraqis and other groups to take back some land. But in order to defeat them, you have to go in and root them out. And you're not going to root them out by bombing on. And everybody understands that. And so it has some impact, but it's not going to solve all the problems that you have. So you have to have a strategy that enables ground capability with integrated with air, bombing and air capability in order to defeat them on the ground. The reason we were successful back in 2006, 7, 8 was because we were able to get back among the population, and we were able to work with the population to defeat the threat. And that's how you're going to defeat this threat. And so you can't do that from the air. And also, you know, again, as I go back to intelligence collection, it would enable us with people on the ground to better utilize our air capabilities in order to be even more successful than we are now.
You know, you spent more time in Iraq than any other general. With hindsight, was there a way to prevent the rise of ISIS? And if so, what would it have looked like?
Well, again, I think that I would say when we pulled everyone out in 2011, again, it was fairly quiet, peaceful, economy was somewhat growing. But I think what we miscalculated on is we didn't realize, and I always said that everybody might not like us, but we are the honest brokers on the ground. And with us there, we're able to help them to work through and solve their problems. And I think when our military left, we also lost some political influence that we had, because having your military there gains you access to have more influence. So I believe we lost some of that influence. And I didn't expect it to happen this quickly as it did, but I was not surprised once I saw that it all goes back to when you have political leaders being arrested, you have military leaders being fired. That led to a population that became disenfranchised from the government, and it allowed ISIS to come in and take advantage of that. And that's what we saw play out.
So if you did it all over again, would you have?
Well, I would, back then, I supported leaving U.S. capability on the ground. Of course, Iraqis had to approve that. I would have increased, I would have put a lot more political effort economically and trying to counteract Iran's influence inside of Iraq. And help them with economic development. So I would have tried to do those things a bit better than we did.
Was there significant intelligence predicting the rise of ISIS?
No, I think we thought, so back, I try not to be a Monday morning quarterback on this, but I think back then we felt that Al-Qaeda had disintegrated, they'd kind of gone away, so we felt like it would be very difficult and take a while for them to come back. But we also did not predict what was happening politically inside of Iraq, which enabled this to happen. We had pushed we either killed or pushed most of the foreign fighters out of Iraq. They either went back to Syria, where they came from. And I think what happened was you then had this movement in Syria. And so they were able to establish a stronghold in Syria, and I believe that then gave them confidence when the Iraqi government was not failing the Sunni population, that gave them an opportunity. And so they then came back into Iraq. I would say with Syria, I would tell you, the whole time we were there, the Syrian government was complicit with Al-Qaeda. And I think it cost them over time, where they allowed these individuals to operate within Syria, and then when they started to have internal problems, they turned against the Syrian government.
Complicit in what sense?
Well, they knew they were there. They knew they were coming into Iraq. They didn't do much to stop it. And they were living inside of Syria.
Baghdadi was on your radar at that time. What can you tell us about him?
Well, I mean, what I remember, he was a local emir in Baghdad. He was a bomb maker running one of the bomb facilities in Baghdad. We had captured him a couple times, released him. He then fled to, I think, Syria. Then he shows, and all of a sudden I see him on TV making a pronouncement that he's the head of ISIS. But I mean, that's what happens. What you have is you have these individuals who've grown up now fighting the U.S. or whatever, an insurgency, and that becomes their life. And so they continue to grow and grow and grow, and some of them become leaders of a movement, which is what he did. The frustrating thing for all our soldiers, sailors, and Marines out there is that most of these people that are operating now, we had in custody at one time, but we had intel on them, knew what they were doing, but we could never prosecute them in a court of law. So you let them go, and here they are back again. So it's frustrating. It's a frustrating thing for us as we deal with this problem.
How important is Baghdadi to the operation? And if he were removed, how deep
Well,
is that?
it's like, we've been through this before. He's important. If we removed him, somebody else will step up. Now, what you don't know is how effective that individual will be. So that's why you have to suppress the movement as a whole. And you have to defeat it in such a way where it no longer carries the influence it had. Again, remember, 10 years ago, we were talking about al-Qaeda in Iraq. Nobody talks about al-Qaeda in Iraq anymore. We defeated that movement. But it regenerated itself now. And so you have to defeat that movement. And when you defeat the movement, it becomes difficult to come back. And if you don't develop a sustainable outcome, it'll be renamed and come back as something else.
How do we rebuild our relationship with Egypt, Saudi Arabia, other nations in light of the deal with Iran? And I say this as a segue, given your comments about Iran's involvement in Iraq.
Well, I will say this, and I will say, I'll just make a comment that I'm for anything that reduces countries getting their hands on nuclear weapons, especially a country like Iran. I really don't want them to have nuclear capability. So they're separate from each other, but they're not separate from each other, if you understand what I'm saying. So I think the fact that we're trying to limit them from having nuclear weapons is okay. You just have to understand that they are creating instability in many other ways through their influence, whether it be in Lebanon, whether it be in Syria, whether it be in Iraq, whether it be in Bahrain, whether it be in Yemen, pick your country. And you have to understand that, and we have to go after them on both fronts. We have to make sure they don't have a nuclear weapon, and we have to make sure that they continue to not create instability in the rest of the Middle East. So I think I think with our long-term partners there, it's important that they see we're serious about making sure they don't have a nuclear weapon, but also serious about making sure that we help to stem the tide of their growing influence in these other countries. So I think it's important for us to sit down with them. I think it's important for the next president to sit down with them and talk about how we are going to work together to solve this problem, and to make sure that we create stability throughout the Middle East, working together. I think now there's some that question our loyalties. I think that's somewhat unfounded, but their perception is maybe our loyalties have switched. And I think it's important for us to reestablish the fact that we want to create stability, and we think that stability comes with appropriate interaction between both sides, and we have to support them as we move forward. So I think it's going to take a lot of diplomatic effort for them to believe in us again and to make sure that we can work together on several fronts. It's hard because the United States stands for democracies, and we try to promote democracy, and that's a hard thing. It takes a long time to develop democracies. It's not going to happen overnight. And I think we have to have some patience when coming to develop democracies. We can't automatically expect them to have a democracy like ours. It takes a long time. It's taken us a long time. And I think sometimes we have to be careful about how when we deal with some of these people, these countries, when we talk about this. Again, ideally, we think democracy is a great way of life, and we want to promote that. But I think sometimes that gets in the way of other things because it takes 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years to develop democracies. And so I worry that causes some problems as well.
And it can be a very painful process.
Yeah, it can be a painful process.
Mm-hmm. Amazingly, our time has really just slipped very quickly. Okay. So before we close out, I'd like to get your thoughts on Russia.
Yeah, so I think it's been very interesting to watch this. I think it's clear that President Putin wants to get Russia back on the international stage as an international leader and he's used his military to do that. Obviously, economically, they have all kinds of problems, but I think he's using his military to make sure everybody understands that they are continue to play a role, whether it be in the Middle East with Syria, whether it be in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine, and oh, by the way, Georgia before that. And now, he has been talking about deploying some anti-ballistic missiles against Japan. So he's clearly trying to reestablish Russia and make sure everybody understands it's a world power. Putin believes that the Cold War ended in the wrong way and it needs to be corrected. And I think he is trying to do that. He's trying to create a buffer around Russia in Eastern Europe. I think he wants to challenge, he would like to see the influence of NATO be much less than it is today. I think he wants to ensure that people know that he's going to play a role in the Middle East. I think what he's done in Syria now, in some ways, has elevated his status in operating within the Middle East. So I think we have to be careful. I believe that, Russia surprised us, frankly, with their abilities when they first went into the Ukraine and how they were able to synchronize capabilities. Russia's always been able to develop military technologies, whether it be air, land, and sea, probably better than any other country. And so they're probably as close as we have to a near-peer competitor in terms of military capability, not economic, but military capability. And so I think we have to pay attention to that. And I think we have to make sure that we are carefully watching what he's trying to accomplish. And I think it's important that we work with our NATO allies in order to ensure that we protect not only the southern flank of NATO as well as the western flank of NATO, or eastern flank of NATO.
Can they be an effective ally for us in the Middle East?
I think it's worth looking into. I don't know. They have probably some different objectives than we do. What's interesting is, when you talk to these different groups, the lightning rod is always the United States in the Middle East. It's not Russia. And I think they like that. And so they want to continue the U.S. be the lightning rod for problems, and then they're able to come in and have some influence that helps them in developing policies in the Middle East. It's clear that, Syria is important to them. It's a port. But it's also important to them with the relationship with Iran that they have. And it's important for them to have a continued relation with whatever the Syrian government looks like as we move forward. And so they see that in their national interests. So I think they're going to continue to play a role in the Middle East. I think that we should try to work with them. Right now, I think it's pretty difficult. I think it would be difficult to work with them. I thought we might have lost an opportunity when we had the attacks in Paris. We had the Russian jetliner shot down. I thought there was an opportunity there to build maybe some coalition of capability that really could have been moved forward, but I thought we lost that opportunity.
Just your final thoughts. What would your advice be to the next administration in terms of setting priorities and goals?
Well, first, I would ask the new administration that we have to strengthen our relationships in Europe. We have to strengthen our relationships in the Middle East. We have to continue to build on the relationships that we have grown in the Asia-Pacific region. And I think that we have to, what I worry about is, I worry that we have isolationist tendencies. I worry that we're going to try to be isolationists and pull ourselves back in the United States. I think that's incredibly dangerous. So the next president, I believe, has to strengthen our relationships. And frankly, they have to believe us. And they have to believe in what we say. And we have to believe that we are there and we're going to work with others to solve these problems. We're not going to say one thing and do another. We're going to stay and do the things that we have agreed to do, whether it be supporting our alliances and developing and making sure people understand that we are going to lead. Everywhere in the last year, everywhere I went, they all want the United States to lead. They believe we're the only ones who can do that. And I think we have to understand how important that is, and and over time it'll affect our economics and everything else. So I think it's important that we understand that.
I'd like to thank General Odierno that was really one of the most enlightening conversations I've had, and so informative too, in quite some time. I'm sure the rest of you join me in thanking him today.
Thank you.